AI-focused digital agency that does a lot of work in the higher ed and B2B spaces. And I am also an aspiring AI alchemist. As I dabble and learn about AI wizardry, I'm here to share some of that with you today. So the talk title was AI-induced Existential Angst for Humans, and my first AI-induced existential crisis happened a year and a half ago. And what was happening was it was around the time when GPT-4 just came out. And I was working on a proposal, and it was due in a day or two, and I needed to get a bunch of team bios, because we had new team members, into the proposal. And so I copied and pasted some example bios, and then put in a few bullet points, and bam, 2 minutes later, I had pretty decent bios. With minor editing, they got put into the proposal, I got it in on time, and that was awesome. The next day, I paused and realized that this was the first time ever I had seen a tool do a better job at something than I was. And not to say that writing bios is definitely not my skill, my core skill or anything, but GPT was better than me at those skills, and it made me pause. If AI is better than me at something I'm bad at, when is it going to become better than me at something I'm good at? And this really shook me to the core and actually began and motivated me to learn absolutely everything I could about AI from that point on. So along the journey, you often, probably everyone in the room here has experienced this, where you get AI-generated nonsense that comes out of some sort of interaction with the prompts. So here's an example, write a Twitter post on how the Drupal Starshot initiative is awesome. And then it writes back, it's not just code, it's a digital adrenaline shot straight into the heart of innovation. So how do you react in your prompting to such a ridiculous prompt? And originally, my first reaction would be to be kind of blunt. Rewrite this garbage and remove the stupid metaphors. But over time, and thinking back to the first idea where it's better than me at something I'm not good at, my prompts became more polite. Please rewrite it in plain, simple language, because you just never know who you might be working for one day. Of course, I have to include the obligatory AI-generated image in the AI-related talk. But the good news is, after looking into it and diving deep for the last year and a half, I've come to the conclusion that AI is not going to take our jobs, but smart people using AI will. And so that's part of the focus of today's talk, just to think about and understand some of the basics about AI and where it's strong and where it's weak, and how we can start leveraging that in our practices as individuals and as organizations. So let's begin with some AI literacy. First off, AI wasn't just created in a vacuum. It's a combination of a number of technologies that have come together. Machine learning is this concept of algorithmic prediction. It's usually really specific. You dump in a ton of data, and what happens is, through algorithms, it can predict outcomes. So a good example is spam filters. Billions of spams have trained it, and that is how it can identify those patterns that identify that email as spam. Another example is autofocus on our smartphones. It's machine learning that's identifying where your face is, and what it's doing is trying to predict where you're going to be when you press the button so that the image is in focus. The next technology that is related to LLMs is natural language processing. This is sort of an evolution of machine learning on its own, and it comes from spell checkers and Google Translate. When we take these two technologies together, and another innovation was added on in about 2017 called transformers. And this combination of machine learning, natural language processing, and transformers enabled it to have an analysis of natural language text that understands the context beyond single words. Before this point, Translator would translate word for word. Back in the old Google Translate days were pretty bad. Now, with transformers, it can start understanding the broader context of a whole sentence or multiple sentences. And then we take all the websites and all the books in the universe and cram those things together, and that's what we have as modern large language models. This is sort of coming out in maybe 2018 or so. Google was sort of first out the gate, and then there's Google Bard and GPT-3 were sort of the first like hardcore LLMs. So to understand LLMs and how they read and how they understand context is really important for us, because all the tools and all the workflows we're using run off of these principles. So using the immortal language of green eggs and ham with another obligatory weird AI generated version of the cover, consider these lines, and we'll go through them how an LLM might interpret these lines for green eggs and ham. So the first off, the LLM looks at each word and breaks it down into tokens. Sometimes longer words need more than one token, and the punctuation is definitely going to become a token. The next step that the LLM does is convert those tokens into what are called vector embeddings. This is a really complicated topic, in which we talked possibly on Peter's talk a little bit later. But think about, basically this enables the LLM to understand the language and perform those analysis on it. So those transformers I talked about will start identifying pieces of the sentence from the whole context of the sentence and do things like identify the subject, identify the object, and identify things like sentiment for that sentence. And as the context grows, it's not just one sentence. It gets layered on with multiple sentences where the context is understood to continue between these sentences, and they get connected. So notice in the first line, the subject is you. The LLM is unable to comprehend and understand that the subject has switched from you to I in the second sentence. Just like green eggs and ham are referred to as them. It understands that them has a significant meaning for that. Sort of the next layer that happens that an LLM might do to analyze this sentence is it ignores the less relevant words. There's basically a lot of fluff in English language, so we can just filter that all out and ignore it, and that's what an LLM is doing. And then it does an emphasis, and it sort of emphasizes the repeated words. And so what it allows it to do is build connections between different concepts. Where green eggs is connected to ham, it understands that green eggs and ham are them, and that the sentiment of do not like applies to both them and to green eggs and to ham. Now, we call this a vector embedding, the vector database. I'm representing here a grossly simplified 2D representation of what's actually going on. But you could imagine that other words that it has in our example here, Sam I Am and Dr. Seuss or whatever, are related to these words, but their proximity is farther apart, like literally in distance. And so the associations that we see here connected are much closer. And that is how I can run an LLM and type in green eggs, ... and this is just GPT and ham, right? That's how that connection is worked. These under the hood, there's these associations put together. So the next concept I want to talk about is the context window, which is basically a large language model's attention span. And so you can think of it as a finite number of words that when you have a chat interaction with an LLM, it can handle. And so, if I'm typing in and it's replying, all of those characters, both in what I type in and how it replies, uses up that context window. And when it runs out, it's actually like deletes the stuff in the middle and forgets it, and makes more space for the conversation to continue. And that keeps on going over time. So that's why, especially on older models that had quite small context windows, if you have a nice long conversation with them, it gets kind of weird. It like forgets what's going on in the middle or whatever. So it's just something to keep in mind as a property of different types of chat clients, making sure that the context window is something that you're paying attention to, because it does forget and doesn't, it's not obvious when it has. The next concept is called RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation. RAGs are actually really simple to explain, really hard to implement, but really simple to explain. It's AI superpowers plus your own private data. That's basically it. And so the simplest way to get RAG in operation is to actually use OpenAI's custom GPTs, where you can simply attach your own private files to the custom GPTs, and you can prompt away on it, and it'll it'll become sort of aware of that private data. There is a warning here. Unless you opt out of training, your own private data is being used to train GPT, so careful with clients or sensitive data. But what happens under the hood when you actually start interacting with a custom GPT is you fill in a prompt, and then the AI itself writes a search based off of whatever you asked. It kind of decides whether it should look at the attached files at all, and it writes its own search for it, goes and gets those files, and returns something, and essentially copies and pastes that text to the bottom of your prompt. So it'd be like quite similar to like if you open the text document and paste it to the bottom of the prompt. It's quite similar, except there's some randomness there, right? When the AI is writing a search, it's not obvious what it's doing, and sometimes you write the same prompt multiple times, you get very different results. It's probably that search that's doing it. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on this. Check it out at Brian's session that's coming up next just in this room if you want to see examples of how to leverage custom GPTs. So this is a list of many of the popular AI tools that I interact with and have used fairly frequently. Just sort of looking at the columns across the top, there's this thing called LRM Arena AI ranking. What this is an attempt to compare how good different models are. And how it works is they put the same questions into different LLMs, and then the answers get anonymized, and then random people across the internet vote on which answer was better. So to me, I actually generally strongly disagree with many of the results, but it is a relative system that's worth for comparison. So like, I really wouldn't worry about who's first and second, but if you're comparing first and second to 10th, I think that that's like a more meaningful comparison. The next item is the context window, which is that memory and how much memory it can handle that we just sort of talked about. And so if you notice that, the context windows are fairly consistent except for a few outliers, but it's important to note. There's the training with your data privacy column there, and notice that do they train with your data has many, many yeses. And so you got to be very careful with how you use these tools and what kind of data you're putting in them, because who knows what that happens to that training data after it's done. And then they have a couple interesting features. I'm just going to highlight GPT 401 preview, which I think just got announced today that it's going to get into a stable release. But it's got this concept of chain of thought prompting, where you ask it a question and it does a series of prompts itself, kind of like double checks its own answer and then comes back. So it's a really cool strategy. We're going to see a lot more models using this in the future. And it's really good for like difficult, tricky problems. I would say is use case that I prefer to use it with now. Google Gemini Pro has this gigantic 2 million token context window. So that works out to about 1.5 million English language characters. And then Anthropic Claude Sonnet is my preferred model for doing anything related to coding. As a side note, if you want to look at Grok, which is the AI trained on Twitter, it has fewer guardrails and humor. So if your LLM project requires your LLM to be an asshole, you can consider Grok. So here's some examples I use frequently in my day-to-day. The first is Perplexity. So this is really like a search engine. And it's really good for research or making like how-to documentation for yourself. So this prompt is make the table I just showed you in the last slide. And it goes, and I've cut about 30 seconds of search time out of the video, but like it goes and it rips through all of that and provided really quite reliable data on this. I do want to say though that that's the paid version of Perplexity where you can change the model that it uses to interpret that information. So this one's using Claude as its model. I found the free Perplexity not so hot. The default model isn't that great. I would say GPT-4 with like search turned on is on average a little better than free Perplexity is, but paid Perplexity is pretty awesome. Another scenario that I like to use in our day-to-day is we have many meetings. And these meetings are put on Zoom, and because we have AI transcribers, we have millions of hours of transcriptions of our own meetings. And sifting through that data is actually a really interesting use case that we started doing in the company. And so this is an example of a prompt where I've said, this is our internal marketing meetings for a month and a half. And I put them into Gemini, and because it's got that gigantic context window, I basically asked it to briefly summarize all activities related to AI-generated emails, and do 5 bullets of what we've accomplished and 5 bullets of things we need to complete. I'm going to press skip here because it's a 2.5-minute prompt. And now it's gone through hours and hours of transcriptions, and it's pulled out a couple key details about the kind of activities that we've been doing. So it's really good if you have like lots of research, lots of meetings and planning documents, or research like user experience research. Now let's go on to what AI can be used in Drupal. I'm going to start off with what works today. This is Northleaf Capital, is a client of ours in a financial services industry. They have a multilingual website, and so it's actually a pretty big challenge to produce, when they do press releases to get the content out. So we're using AI translation on the tool. You simply log in, request translation. It sends that data over to a LLM called DeepL, which is a translation-focused AI tool. 2 seconds later, comes back with the translation complete. It's an AI tool. We don't trust it, right? A human being goes, reviews it. Part of the French team from the French staff goes and reviews it, but it's, from what we've heard, like 3 to 5 corrections are typical from the machine translation that comes back. Related as well is, on the accessibility side of things, we can have AI-based alt tags added to our images. And this is, again, just install the AI image alt tag module, connect it to OpenAI, and it's passing this image over and getting the OpenAI to write the alt tags for them, and it does a really good job. Like, probably better than 80% of human beings I've seen try to write alt tags. And so, it's just really, it's really impactful and able to be used today in our websites. Now, there is a lot of action happening in the Drupal AI space that's going to be available in 2025. The first one that is crazy is the integrated AI agents, where you prompt Drupal to create content types, taxonomies, or whatever. You build Drupal in Drupal with AI. It's wild. Another really interesting example is, or use case is when you use AI chat or AI search, and how I was identifying RAG at the beginning, your own private data. Well, you use RAG with your website's published content, and then can use vector databases to search and come with way better and more meaningful search results from it. Or you could put a chatbot where you actually have a discussion, and then the answers from the discussion appear inside of your website itself. Chatbot is a lot higher risk because you got to put the guardrails. It could say something weird back to people on your website. But search, I think, is a lot more practical and definitely like a viable 2025 thing because it's just returning search results. So the risk is, if it gives you bad search results, that's the worst that'll happen. It won't embarrass your brand or whatever, right? And so if you want to learn about that, 2 sessions away in this exact spot is Pierre's presentation on how to do AI-powered search. So to wrap it up, how do we plan for this unprecedented change? It came out 2 days ago, there's 12 days of OpenAI announcements and releases, and it's just crazy. The rate of change is very difficult to manage. So I think there's really 3 key strategies. We need to make sure that ourselves and our teams are literate in basic AI concepts. We need to establish systems of learning and practice where we're always learning, both as individuals and as organizations. And as we work on projects, we just need to plan to iterate. Because the tool that's amazing and cool that comes out tomorrow on these OpenAI announcements will probably be less exciting than the one that comes out 6 months after it. So we just need to plan to iterate for the next couple of years because we've got this intense velocity of development. That's just the world we live in. And so we might as well just set up our systems of implementation to match the reality that we're living in. So, how to get started? I'd like to announce that, so I'm one of the organizers of the Drupal Toronto meetup, and we're rebooting the meetup in 2025 to be an expanded scope of content. So we've got AI topics and Drupal topics combined together. So some will be just AI, some will be Drupal and AI, and some will be just Drupal. But we're going to focus on in-person and virtual meetups together. So please come and join us, and we can all learn together. That's it. Thank you very much, everyone. Any questions? Do we have time for questions?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Is the Altag AI module ready right now?
Yes. Yeah. It's alpha. It has security coverage and just works really well. And again, I guess my opinion here is like, if your AI alt tag generator fails because OpenAI's API crashes or something, you just don't get an alt tag back. So it's an acceptable level of risk.
Connected question to you. So when you are using this AI-generated algorithms or cloud models to generate alt tags, captions, etc., how do we ensure data privacy and security for the customers?
So it's definitely a relevant question. When you use these tools in Drupal, it's going to be connecting to the API of the LLM provider. Read carefully the privacy policies and that data on that side. But again, it depends on the data. An alt tag is for public consumption. So I would say that's a low risk kind of data. If you have private user data or, again, focusing on public user content to train a search result, the content's there, Google's going to index it. But yeah, we definitely want to be careful about those private services.
When you're working for private services, public portals basically.
Yeah.
So, and you want to use AI-related services. So, then, should we be using in-house AI algorithms, or is it okay? Is there any settings in cloud which wouldn't expose data before their algorithms?
Yeah, so the API-based services so Gemini is private if you pay. OpenAI is private if you pay. So I think it would be use the due diligence necessary to look at the levels of risk, or run Llama, which you could run your own custom AI model that's open source and completely run it within your own infrastructure.
Hey, not a question but a comment on your about AI tools being used. I was actually speaking with someone who works for an international charity, and they would have to rely on translators on video calls before. But recently he was ranting that with Teams, he just turns on AI translator and helps his business significantly. So that was really cool to hear.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Okay. I have one question. Is there a policy where we're required to disclose that we're using AI in the site to generate content?
No. So this is a pain point that I think we're all going to live with for a little while. There is very little reasonable regulatory guidance from government levels anywhere. I think the European Union is sort of trailblazing this a little bit, but there is no obligation to generate to say that the AI was generated. There is like the CP writing style. They're like, how do you cite GPT? And so like, you know, we're just figuring out all these issues now, but I think reasonable laws, like, hey, this was AI generated, or put some kind of icon or something on all the content that's out there is probably a wise ethical choice we could choose to do in advance of the regulation, which hopefully, it'll definitely come too late, but it'll eventually come. Yeah.
More questions? Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.